After my previous video gave my top 5 maps that I'd want to see in Battlefield 6, this is my list of maps from almost each Battlefield game I'd like to see return at some point. I also saw a lot of comments on the top 5 video of people wanting new map designs instead of remakes, and to that I wholeheartedly agree, and I expect that will be the case. Remember that almost all Battlefield games have featured a few remakes for the sake of nostalgia, so this video leans more into the question of if they choose to remake a couple of maps, this is what I'd recommend. We open this list with the granddaddy of all Battlefield titles, 1942. When we consider how or even if a map from this game could or should be remade, we have to take into account the severe limitations of the day. We cannot just expect so many levels with so much empty space or lack of cover to be functional in the modern era, and even with some upgrades, this poses major risks, as the 2042 remakes of El Alamein and Battle of the Bulge proved. With that in mind, Liberation of Khan would be my pick from 1942 to return in a reimagined or upgraded format, since it was not only one of the best maps of the game in terms of experience and structure, but it also checks off a lot of boxes necessary to make that transition from old to modern a lot smoother. These are things like strong building placement, boundaries, terrain deviation, and natural geography. Khan is a map where the Allied faction barrels across the French countryside to attack German bases in the open field and within the urban city, allowing for different playstyles over a constantly changing battleground. Vietnam, as a historically niche title and distinct setting, poses a similar problem to 1942, in that the technology of the day resulted in many open and exposed map landscapes, but also in that the game's theme must bend to make the map work in a modern setting. Aside from perhaps one urban layout, which might have some success in a reimagined state, the clear-cut winner for this game is Operation Flaming Dart, an epic vehicular experience where controlling the skies was critical for success. 7 jets and 5 helicopters were present, taking off at various airfields. A unique layout which lends itself to a quasi-amphibious invasion of the mainland, teams fought over 3 objectives which were detailed well. Infantry and tanks sprawled along the river and shoreline for control of the flags, while aircraft battled overhead, frequently bombing huge numbers of enemies or dropping off players in the opposing team's bases to sow chaos. Battlefield hasn't had an air-dominated map like this in some time, and with some adjustments to spacing, it could work really well in any time period. While my previous video highlighted my desire to see Operation Road Rage come back for one hell of an armored clash, I'll put it aside for a moment in favor of another gigantic sandbox powerhouse. Featured in the latter of Battlefield 2's booster packs, Operation Harvest is not well known. This certainly owes to being overshadowed by Road Rage, which was released in the same pack. Also like Road Rage, Operation Harvest, not to be confused with Harvest Day from the Bad Company titles, is another of the first Battlefield levels set in the continental United States. This time the setting is a massive stretch of farmland in rural Pennsylvania. The terrain has just enough rolling hills to break massive sightlines, something which would be critical in a frostbite upgrade without a draw distance fog. Nearly 15 armored vehicles are scattered across 9 flags and deployments. Jet aircraft are unavailable, replaced in importance by 1 attack helicopter and 1 scout helicopter per team. On Harvest, ground armor pushed through the vast fields, over rivers, and across bridges to fight at multiple farmsteads. These landmarks were large industrial facilities, providing great mini-environments for infantry combat and countering the aggressive vehicles. To rapidly traverse the distances between objectives, plentiful light transports are provided, further adding to the action in this huge confrontation. Although set in the United States in Battlefield 2, there is no reason why the layout cannot be reimagined elsewhere. Heading to 2142, we encounter the same issue present in Battlefield Vietnam. Only in this case, many of the game's maps are tailored to the specific modes and equipment unique to it. Deciding on one that would work in a modern setting proved so challenging, I am defaulting to one of its best urban conquest assault layouts in Tunis Harbor. This map is essentially No Shark Canals before there was No Shark Canals. Set in an abandoned North African port, PAC forces assault the EU base, which is laid out in a horseshoe around the dock. Spacious enough to provide enough buildings and cover for decent pathing options, it is nevertheless an intense grind from start to finish. The sand haze limits sightlines, and with good reason. Swimming across the canal is possible, but so is sniping from the other side. Featuring a handful of armored assets which could be retooled for any setting, Tunis Harbor is one of the few 2142 levels capable of making the modern, or should I say backward, jump. Moving to the Bad Company series, these two picks come with the major sticking point that both games were heavily, exclusively in the case of Bad Company 1, console-oriented. Servers had a cap of 24 players max, but this didn't stop PC servers from bumping it up to 32. This limit remains a factor in these games' map design and a challenge for bringing them back. While an argument can be made that it's actually necessary, I am discounting major redesigns or additions to the map pool, such as the changes and expansions that were made to Arica Harbor and Valparaiso in 2042. For Bad Company 1, I would recommend Oasis, largely because of its town layout, which is exceptional for small-scale conquest rounds, as well as team deathmatch and squad deathmatch. The greater map environment used during the Rush game mode provides gameplay variety through different geography, engagement ranges, and vehicle selections. For Bad Company 2, Panama Canal is my pick to return. Another dockyard map from the same designer as No Shark Canals, this purely conquest map features 4 objectives total, the most in the game. It is actually quite large by BC2 standards and accommodates a number of ground vehicles despite its cluttered layout. This includes 1 tank and IFE per team, along with another IFE as a flag spawn. Frequent bottlenecks make the armor challenging as landmines prevent access while plenty of surrounding objects provide cover and flanking options. Overall, it is arguably one of the best conquest maps in Bad Company 2, and if a game wanted to follow up on the BF3 close quarter style of map design, Panama would be a great and welcome addition. There are a number of good Battlefield 3 maps, some with more notoriety than others. My pick from Battlefield 3 is Tala Market, not just because it is a fantastic close quarters design, but because it was a later DLC map which many of the game's earlier player base may have missed out on. A conquest assault map, which is honestly my only major criticism, Tala offers some of the best infantry combat outside of the close quarters DLC. It might only be slightly larger than Operation 925 from that pack, but the urban setting allows for a few light transports to roam the streets and spice things up. Lighting is perfect, and objectives distinct. Rooftop access is found primarily at only 2 locations, which makes these areas more predictable. Overall, just a really solid design, which is a hell of a lot of fun. Battlefield 4's choice came down to a coin flip between Zavad 311 and Propaganda, but ultimately I went with the latter. The environment of Zavad is classic, and the collection of rusted tanks are cool, but trains that can kill tanks is just too awesome to pass up on. The only Battlefield map set in North Korea, Propaganda is a medium-scale map in the heart of Pyongyang. A 5-flag layout, tall concrete buildings line one side of a major street, while a lower neighborhood sits on the other side across the notoriously dangerous train tracks. A parked train provides great cover, but the gas tanks can be detonated, eliminating infantry and armor. Meanwhile, the repeating freight train, which comes barreling north to south, provides protection for players, while also being one of the greatest dynamic hazards of any Battlefield game. It carries its own explosive tanks, but the more notorious threat is simply being plowed over if one isn't paying attention. An urban design featuring 2 tanks per team, it is nonetheless infantry-focused and kept mostly at ground level, with verticality limited to a handful of 2-story buildings, most of which are destructible. One thing to note on the previous 2 maps, Tala Market and Propaganda were reportedly data mined for Battlefield 6, but as I continue to stress, don't trust anything datamine related until an official announcement is made. Hardline only has a handful of what we would consider big maps by Battlefield standards, and while I think adapting them to larger military conflicts is possible, it is far easier to bring back many of its stunningly good infantry maps for which it is largely known. One which prominently stands out is Museum, a 5-objective masterclass in design, structure, and aesthetics. A completely indoor environment, the museum is split into 5 main zones, with the grand atrium in the center and 4 adjacent wings. These areas differ significantly, as most have unique themes or historical collections, such as prehistoric mammals, insects, a planetarium, and by far the 2 largest exhibits, ancient Egypt and dinosaurs. Action is intense and fast-paced, with players whipping around corners and firing from balconies. Cover is abundant, found in the marble facades and pillars, as well as various artifacts which line the halls. Destruction doesn't come from the building, but from these items, and some have major effects on the rooms. The thing about Museum is that it is entirely self-contained, and doesn't take itself seriously. It isn't themed in such a way that it cannot be reset in a different country relative to the game's narrative, and being a collection of exhibits, there is no reason why these couldn't change from game to game, while the excellent layout remains the same each time. Naturally, going into Battlefield 1 and Battlefield 5, the maps obviously pull from a historic World War setting. This significantly limits options, so the picks represent what might best work for all eras. This includes Amiens from Battlefield 1, which, honestly, hasn't evolved much physically from its historic aesthetic. In this way, many of the same building styles and street structure can be recreated, with minor changes bringing it to a modern setting if need be. Amiens almost needs no introduction. It is a pillar of Battlefield 1, a combined arms urban experience of high intensity, drawing on the rich history and inspirations of Moschur City and Seine Crossing. Verticality is limited, kept to the second floors of predictable apartments flush with hallways and vantage points. The remaining action is kept to the main roads and alleyways where tanks can roam and infantry scurry to flank around them. Amiens has a layout which truly needs minimal changes, if only to address some poor exposed spawn points or longer sightlines. Similarly, Devastation is my top pick from Battlefield 5 to return at some point. This map, set after the German firebombing of Rotterdam, embodies its name in a smoldering hellscape of smoke and ruins. A small-scale combined arms level featuring a few sparse tanks, it is dominated by infantry combat which tends to rotate around the square layout from objective to objective. The thing about Devastation is that, conceptually, this map doesn't need to take place in Rotterdam. As long as the map structure is respectfully adhered to, it can be set in any modern or historic city torn apart by whatever calamity the game's setting or story calls for. Replacing the massive cathedral as the map's iconic centerpiece location would be the only thing that might prove challenging. When I conceptualized this video, I was thinking squarely about most classic Battlefield games, and it never occurred to me that, oh yeah, I'd need to pick something from 2042. Options in this bucket are, well, understandably poor. I selected Redacted in this slot purely because it is, in my opinion, one of the best maps that game had to offer. Redacted is a linear-style infantry meat grinder map, with limited lanes of attack creating high-intensity bottlenecks. It is certainly not the first of this style of map in the franchise. Many people think of Operation Metro or Locker when the topic is discussed, and the comparison is readily present. However, Redacted actually offers slightly more pathing options than either of those maps, providing a better chance to break through the avalanche of rockets and grenades and flank your enemy to not only turn the entire match around, but wrap behind the lines and deliver some of the most insane kill streaks imaginable. Being infantry only, some players may scoff at the suggestion, and feelings about such gameplay is naturally divisive, but I did suggest maps from a wide range of playstyles. The issue with this kind of map is that it is fairly easy to replicate, as the basic structure is literally straightforward. However, in this I hold that Redacted is still the best iteration of the linear meat grinder experience, owing to its unique tunnels and isolated pockets of combat. It is also one of the best themed and detailed levels of 2042, and in a game where poor textures and vastly empty environments are the norm, Redacted stands out like a diamond in the rough. That concludes my list of maps from almost every Battlefield game that I'd like to see return at some point. I know everyone has their favorites, and let's be real honest, most of it is extremely subjective. This list does have a bit of personal bias towards some maps, but most have been broken down and heavily analyzed over the years and fit my criteria of great design, balance, and gameplay, which earned them a spot here, at least in my opinion. Of course, I'd be happy to hear what maps you would want back in a future title. The one thing that we can count on is that classic maps will continue to return to future Battlefield games, and you never know what might appear next.